bon?
Ah, là, je vous entends, c'est bon. Fait que si vous voulez parler un peu pour faire le test de son.
OK. Bonjour, Madame la greffière. J'espère que vous allez bien. Je vous souhaite une bonne semaine. J'espère que le son pour les interprètes est bon.
Oui, tout est beau, merci beaucoup.
Oreilles. OK, merci.
I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 124 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. This meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Before I proceed, I would like to make a few comments for the benefit of witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognise you by name before speaking. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. Please address all comments through the chair. Of course, today we're studying derelict and abandoned vessels, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on February 8, 2024. The committee is resuming its study of derelict and abandoned vessels. We'd like to welcome our witnesses on the first panel. We have today Bonnie Brockenshire, environmental professional, and David Mitchell, Mayor of Bridgewater. Thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will each have 5 minutes or less for your opening statement. Ms. Brockenshire, you have the floor.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, Vice Chair, and esteemed committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I appreciate your dedication to safeguarding Canada's marine ecosystems by addressing complex challenges facing our oceans, including derelict and abandoned vessels. I am grateful to contribute today to the conversation. I've lived on the west coast of Canada all my life, and I currently reside on Nekleelequam, Bowen Island. Bowen Island's about 10 kilometres by boat from downtown Vancouver. During the past 18 years, I've had the privilege of working on various marine-based projects, including planning and implementing multi-pronged approaches to restoring socio-ecological and socio-economic vibrancy in bays located in Acatsum, Howe Sound. I'm an environmental professional with years of experience in local government, focusing primarily on the Acatsum region of the Salish Sea. Throughout my career, I've been honoured to collaborate with the Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, community action groups, marine contractors, provincial government agencies, elected officials like MP Patrick Wheeler, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and Transport Canada, all with a common goal aimed at mitigating pollution, ecosystem degradation, social concerns, and economic impacts stemming from derelict and abandoned vessels. Often exhausting the local government toolbox. For example, on Bowen Island, we've adopted relevant bylaws, we've obtained a provincial tenure to enable legal management of marine areas, and we've spent our limited budgets. We look to higher levels of government for financial and enforcement support. We were successful in establishing strong working relationships with provincial and federal staff, but in my experience, their legislated authority, funding, and staffing resources were constraining. I could speak at length about the many facets of derelict and abandoned vessels, but today I would like to focus on one issue I feel of paramount importance. If we are to achieve long-lasting change, specifically the proliferation of mooring buoys in vulnerable areas like Acatsum and other regions of the Salish Sea, and how they relate to the problem of derelict and abandoned vessels. In my experiences, bays that are inundated with mooring buoys are often inundated with derelict and abandoned vessels. Once a mooring buoy is dropped in the ocean, the associated tackle, anchor chain, and block remain in place, sometimes around Bowen Island for up to 50 years. There's been some there from anecdotal conversations with locals. The seafloor around the anchoring system of the buoys is often devoid of life from constant chain scouring. Federal programs such as the Oceans Protection Plan have been positive steps, and I deeply appreciate the work done by staff within DFO and TC to exercise their jurisdictional authorities. However, the number of mooring buoys installed throughout Acatsum and the number of vessels tied to them undoubtedly will continue to increase if legislation, regulation, and funding for enforcement is not strengthened. The Canadian Navigable Waters Act and the associated private buoy regulation, if they were to be opened, there is room for augmentation with respect to mooring buoys, which are considered minor works. Looking at ways to address the proliferation of mooring buoys and ultimately the vessels, derelict and abandoned, tied to these buoys, are important if we are to enhance the well-being of all species living near, on, and in our oceans. Thank you once again for your time, your efforts, and your consideration of this issue, and I look forward to the questions and comments today.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Mitchell for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to speak to you on the issue of derelict vessels. This is actually my second time addressing the committee. I was here maybe 5-6 years ago. And I will say that since the last time I was here, much has changed in our community. First, however, I want to share about the impact of having these vessels on our community. Almost 3 decades ago, the federal government of the day was divesting itself of federal wharves. In the town of Bridgewater, the federal wharf was given to a society called the Artificial Reef Society. The purpose of this group was self-explanatory in its name, to create artificial reefs in the Atlantic Ocean, ironically something you cannot do. They assumed control of the wharf, and shortly thereafter, the problems began. For those not familiar with the town of Bridgewater, we are a town of 9,000 people. We are the economic center of the South Shore of Nova Scotia, and our beautiful town is divided by a tidal river, the Lahave, which leads directly to the Atlantic. In 1998, the Society decided to acquire the HMCS Fraser, a St. Laurent-class destroyer that served in the Royal Canadian Navy that was declared surplus. Their plan was to convert this ship to a floating museum, yet they had no funding secured to do so. I want to note that because I'm not aware if there is currently a policy that would prevent the acquisition of surplus vessels, especially from the military, by organizations like there was for the Fraser. But had there been one that set out rules for such acquisitions, such as ensuring funding was even in place for any proposed future use beyond scrap, our story would be much different. While the Fraser and its proud history sat rotting at our wharf, the Society then welcomed the HMCS Cormorant, a Royal Canadian Navy diving support vessel, to the wharf in 2000. To this day, the ownership of that vessel is still in dispute, but what cannot be disputed is the fact that it was the Society that allowed it to dock in our town. This is another ship with an incredible history, and for the record, it was part of the 1994 expedition to recover the ship's bell from the SS Edmund Fitzgerald in Lake Superior. Yet, like the Fraser, sat rotting, eventually listing, sinking, being raised, listing again, for 21 years until it was finally removed in 2021. The Fraser was bought back by the Canadian Forces in 2009 from the Artificial Reef Society for $1 and taken away to Sheet Harbour for scrap at a cost of potentially millions. Over the years, the wharf changed ownership from the Artificial Reef Society to the actual chair of the society itself. Nobody knows how that happened. And for over 20 years, a number of fishing trawlers were then docked at the wharf, again, to rot like all the others. The impact on our community was threefold. First, the risk to the environment was always heightened, a fear across our entire community daily. These vessels were in constant danger of breach and were known to still contain fuels, oils, and lubricants. And remember, this is a tidal river, so any spills would impact dozens of kilometers of river and shoreline, all with homes, parks, and community uses. The other is the impact it had on local property values and the community's morale. While the excitement of the arrival of the Fraser quickly wore off when it was clear there was no viable plan to do anything with the ship, as more and more ships arrived and were simply left there without any purpose or plan, our flagship community park, which was directly across from these, was always in the shadow of decay. The homes in the area that faced these had depressed valuations, and the wharf itself, left rotting behind the vessels, something we didn't even know until the Cormorant was removed, could never be redeveloped or used for its intended purpose. The impact these vessels have, regardless of the community they're in, goes beyond just the vessels themselves. It is the obvious space they take up and the environmental risk I mentioned, but I don't want to discount the impact it has on a community itself, knowing they essentially have no tools or ability to get rid of these vessels without the support or lead of a federal organization or the Coast Guard itself. There is some good news, finally, for our story. Last year, the wharf was sold to new owners, and just a few months ago, less than 2 months in fact, the 3 trawlers that were remaining were dismantled on site, and now we no longer have any vessels at our wharf. The new owner apparently has some new exciting plans for the community, and I haven't seen those, but I've been told by them that the community will be very happy. And I cannot express how happy our people are to no longer have to look at these vessels and not to worry about the chemicals coming out of them and into the water. There are new rules in place that should prevent this from happening here and elsewhere, but I cannot stress enough just how damaging or impactful it can be to have any kind of watercraft left to rot. So I thank you for your time today, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you for keeping on time. Anyway, we'll now go to our first round of questioning. We'll go to Mr. Small for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today to take part in this study. First off, Mr. Mitchell, basically what you described as a graveyard for vessels in Bridgewater. All those vessels that you described, were they considered abandoned and derelict, or would they be on the list of 120 or so vessels in Atlantic Canada? Would they have made that list or not?
So my understanding is they did eventually make the list, but it took some time to get them there as the ownership was in dispute. So we had years where someone would claim ownership and then they would deny ownership, and so the Cormorant was eventually added to that list, and as were the others behind it, eventually though.
So do you have any suggestions for the committee as to how that process could be streamlined?
That's a great question. For me, I think we even have to go back to the original, and the points I was trying to make on my opening remarks was none of this would have happened had a divestiture of a federal property gone into the proper hands with a plan. So to me, it's not just the ability to abandon a vessel at a wharf, it's who has control of that wharf that even can allow a vessel to come upriver in our case and abandon them. In terms of the process, I think now the process has been tightened and it is easier to get a vessel on the derelict and abandoned vessel list. Our issue was when ownership is in dispute, that process can take years. As we know, the court system can just take years and years, and that's what happened to us. It was back and forth.
So the problems that you've encountered there in Bridgewater, are you familiar with any other municipalities throughout your region that have had similar problems, or is Bridgewater being targeted for dropping off these vessels?
No, so the town of Shelburne, Nova Scotia, had the Farley Mowat dock there and sank for many years. So that has also since been corrected, but that was almost a decade of that vessel parked at a wharf that blocked it from being truly used as a port that it should have been. So I know that when I testified here many years ago, the mayor of the town of Shelburne also spoke to the exact same issue. It's an open port. It's kind of a free-for-all. If it looks like there's dock space, they'll come up and park them there.
So how about the coastline and the beaches and our coastal communities in your part of Nova Scotia? Are there? Do you think that the list of abandoned vessels in Atlantic Canada represents the actual number of abandoned vessels, or do you think there might be a few more than are recorded? I
think there are some more. I know certainly up around Cape Breton there's some that are on beaches. I think probably it's discounted because they're small. So I know on the West Coast it's a lot of small craft that are considered derelict and abandoned. On the East Coast it tends not to be pleasure boats. It tends to be trawlers, scallop draggers, and things like that. So I do know that there are some communities that they've been there for 50 years, and so they're kind of off of the radar of the list, while the focus is on newer ones that have been more recently left there.
Yeah, because it seems to me that 935 in British Columbia and only 119 in all of Atlantic Canada's 4 provinces. There might be quite a few that are not on that list.
Yeah, again, I believe my understanding is that in the West Coast it is mostly smaller pleasure craft
Yes.
that are left, and for us it's fewer, but they're much larger.
Thank you, Mayor Mitchell.
Yeah.
My next question is for Ms. Brokenshire. Mr. Mitchell just mentioned that the Fairley Mowat had been abandoned, and I find that odd from such a champion of the environment and the ocean and all things wonderful, that a ship like the Fairley Mowat would be abandoned, and for someone who cares so much about the ocean to even have their name on the side of a vessel that's abandoned and polluting is shocking. You mentioned the lack of funds. Has your group reached out to the Suzuki Foundation or any groups like that, ENGOs that work on various causes? Do you think some of these groups should care more about and put more money into helping remove some of these threats to the ocean as abandoned vessels and moorings?
Throughout Acatsum House Sound, we have very strong working relationships with the David Suzuki Foundation and other NGOs, and I find very engaged community members as well. The local municipality, Bowen Island municipality in particular, and Squamish and other municipalities around the Sound do have some budgets. We haven't tapped into asking for funding specifically for abandoned and derelict vessels. There's a lot of work that has to go on prior to actually removing the vessel, as we know, with finding the owners, going through many sort of channels that lead to dead ends. But where I would say that the action groups, NGOs, have been extremely successful and very busy is the aftermath of derelict and abandoned vessels, the cleanup, so being more reactive, because I think speaking to lots of these folks, it just seems daunting with the legislation and the multi-tiered government legislation. We've got the local bylaws and the provincial layer and the federal layers. So potentially it could be a source of funding. But as I say, currently it's more the reactive aspect where they've been active.
Thank you for that. And we'll now go to Mr. Waller for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I want to thank both the witnesses for being here today. Ms. Brokenshire, I want to ask a couple questions of you. You mentioned that Mannion Bay and you're seeing other bays that have a lot of mooring buoys are having a lot of damage down to the ocean floor because of sometimes you have buoys there for 50 years or more. And I know the Bowen Island municipality took a fairly innovative approach to doing what it could to tackle this issue, both through creating a new bylaw as well as getting tenure to manage these marine areas. So I was hoping you could share with this committee the process that you went through or that the municipality went through and what the impact that's had over time has been.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. It's a long tale, which I don't have time to talk about, but when I say multi-pronged approach, it truly is a multi-pronged approach. I just want to go back 15 years where the community, the kids were told by their parents not to go to the shores of Mannion Bay. There were really high E. coli counts. There was junk, just debris all over the shores. So in my experience in Acatsum, derelict and abandoned vessels occur where there's some place for them to tie up to, where there's a safe landing spot, and where they're close to amenities, all of which those three components are alive and well around Mannion Bay. So the bay was inundated with mooring buoys. There were over 50 mooring buoys in an area. If you go by the private buoy regulations and you consider swing distance, so swing distance based on depth of water, I calculated that 16 buoys could be in that bay, but yet there were over 50. So, and there were I would say upwards of 12 to 15 abandoned vessels. So we started on trying to establish some tools and working with other levels of government. So we obtained a license of occupation, a tenure from the province. And the reason why we did that is that it did give us some authority with respect to trespass, but it's a kind of a loose tool. And then we also achieved, were able to achieve or instate a bylaw for charging for mooring buoys. So we needed the tenure in place first to establish a mooring buoy bylaw where we actually charge a fee for mooring buoys, a nominal fee, which then goes back into the ecological restoration of the bay. But that was through the tenure. We have a use of water areas and beach area bylaw that we instated. We've also got a voluntary non-anchor zone to protect the eelgrass. We couldn't have a no-anchor zone because it's not a navigable water channel. It's a bay, protected bay. But we do have protected the eelgrass that way, plus just community involvement and lots of eyes on the bay. We've definitely, over the last 15 years, decreased the number. There's no abandoned vessels in the bay. With the mooring buoy bylaw, we have to, the owners of the vessels tied to the buoys have to register with the municipality. So there's a lack of anonymity now with those folks in the bay. So we have no abandoned vessels. The mooring buoy suites from Transport Canada have been invaluable. It's very hard to get Transport Canada to come out because it's a lot of staffing resources, but they have been so useful. And if I could say one thing, that would be like just having monies to allow staff to come out and do mooring buoy sweeps. We've reduced the number of mooring buoys down to about 27. And Transport Canada, the federal government, paid for the removal of all that tackle, and we impounded the buoys at the time that were abandoned and derelict and tied to those buoys. So that the federal government also paid for the disposal of those vessels. So, but since that, it's really tricky to get mooring buoy sweeps conducted in the bays that need them. So that would be my takeaway, if I could say one thing today.
Thank you very much for that. One of the other comments you mentioned was that the legislative authority was constraining, and that if the Wrecked, Abandoned, and Hazardous Vessels Act was opened up, that there was some room for augmentation. And so I was hoping you might be able to share with the committee what some of your ideas might be for that augmentation.
Yeah, like with respect to, I think, just speaking to the correlation of mooring buoys and abandoned and derelict vessels, like if the Navigable Waters Protection Act was opened up, I think it would be beneficial to see more enforcement of provisions related to mooring buoys. Like basically right now, as long as a mooring buoy conforms to the above aesthetics, the above waters aesthetics, it can be kind of plunked down wherever. Once the buoy is in place, it's in place. Even though we go out and we do GPS, we take coordinates of all the mooring buoys around Bowen Island, so we know which ones have been put in. We do that every 6 months. But still, even with that database, the GIS layer that we are welcomely share, we still can't get the action to come and remove those buoys. So enforcement, I think, is really a key. And I would really like to see some sort of maybe regulation associated with private buoys, as that seems to be the issue in a Catsum House Sound.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Waller. We'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses. Thank you for being here. I'll ask a question that I put to everyone. I represent Quebec. It's a question I put to all witnesses from the West Coast. Do you have any communications with environmentalists? I heard Ms. Brokenshire talk about collaboration with the Suzuki Foundation, someone I know very well. Do you have any communications with various representatives from Quebec when it comes to the phantom vessels in the Gulf? or is your expertise focusing only on the West Coast?
Idéalement.
One person at a time, ideally.
I did get some of your question. Thank you very much. Yes, primarily focused on the West Coast.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. I don't know if there was another component to the question. I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Non, mais j'ai des questions quand même.
No, I do have questions.
Communication would have been with federal and provincial departments of the environment more than environmental groups.
Vous avez un mandat, Monsieur le maire.
Mr. Mayor, you have a huge mandate before you. After listening to you, the situation is very serious. I listened to your testimony, and I think that there's a management and legislative void. Would a specific act or regulation be necessary to govern this situation, to govern the vessels? Would this help through federal government legislation? Could we improve the situation you described?
For example, there's the two pieces. So it was a federal piece of property that was put into private hands with no checks and balances to see what its use was going to be. I'm sure, looking back, if whoever made that decision to give it to the Artificial Reef Society, my understanding is not only did they give it to the Artificial Reef Society, they gave them money to maintain it. So taxpayer money actually funded creating this graveyard for ships. And then the other component is two very historically significant Canadian military vessels were given to an organization that had no plan. So the Fraser was one of the first Canadian naval ships for female sailors. That's pretty important, and yet that history just gets dismissed. And if you do a Wikipedia search on that ship, all that history ends with a little line at the bottom that says it was just rotting in Bridgewater. And the Cormorant, as I said, recovered the bell from the Edmund Fitzgerald. That's pretty impressive, and yet no checks and balances. So in terms of some federal regulation, I think there's opportunity for two there. Better checks and balances for divesting of any federal property, wharves particularly. But how do we, whether it's a Coast Guard vessel, a Navy vessel, how do we make sure that whoever takes that on can fund and support whatever future use it has?
Donc, je comprends qu'il n'y a pas seulement la réglementation,
I understand that it's not the matter of regulation, but also funding, which is serious. I don't know if you are aware of this. In my colleague's writing, my colleague to the right, is it your writing? No, it's Maxime's writing. There is something that was sunk. The process started in 2003. A former Canadian war vessel. There's lots of amateur diving in the St. Lawrence River, and this is an extremely complex river when it comes to waterways, currents, and so on. So instead of using the Empress of Ireland, they used another vessel to make this a teaching vessel for students. The vessel was secured, all hazardous material and ammunition was removed, and this was immersed in the St. Lawrence River. I don't know if you heard about this, but is this something that could be promising for some vessels? Could some vessels be used this way as a teaching place for divers?
And I think yes is the answer. My understanding is even as a country, we have two different rules. Unless something has changed in the last few years, you can submerge a vessel on the West Coast for an artificial reef. You cannot submerge a vessel in the Atlantic for an artificial reef. Same department makes that decision coast to coast, but it's two different. And so again, with that wharf in our case being handed over to the Artificial Reef Society, I believe that was their original intent, and then they were not able to do it. So I think it's a great idea. It happens around the world where vessels are properly cleaned and sunk and used for tourist activities, diving, teaching. But right now, unless something has changed in the last few years, I don't think it can happen in the Atlantic.
Thank you, Madam Debienne. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to the witnesses here today. First of all, I had no idea, through the Chair, that had happened with the 2 HMCS vessels on the East Coast. That's really upsetting to hear. I know we have an HMCS Nanaimo on the West Coast in my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith. It's in Esquimalt, and I know the crew takes incredible care of those vessels. I know that the vessels do work currently around illegal substance work, preventing illegal narcotics from reaching our shores. But the care of the vessel and the pride that the crew take in that vessel, and also the pride felt by the community of the work that's being done is tremendous. And so to hear that there have been 2 HMCSs that have been left like this for so many years is very disheartening. And so just to clarify, the museum never happened. Just to clarify, could you say it in there just so that it's on the record?
Yeah, absolutely correct. No, the museum never came to be. Nothing came to be of the ship.
Okay, that's very disheartening, because I know that there is also limited resources going into this important work as well. Something to keep an eye on for the rest of the HMCSs as we move forward on a process. The other question that I had, Mr. Mitchell, you had spoken about the 3 trawlers that were dismantled on site. I know, perhaps you're not the expert on this, but do you have any more information that you can provide to us around what that looked like, who did it? Just any further information would be very helpful.
Yeah, for sure. So that was it was a process led by the Canadian Coast Guard. Thank goodness the funding for that wasn't from the taxpayer. It was from the Ship Source Pollution Fund. So my understanding is that fund is paid for by industry, and so the Coast Guard will be going after the owners of the vehicles, to the vessels, to try to recoup that. But if not, at least it's not coming from a pot of taxpayer money. 2 of the ships were able to be pulled up onto shore to be dismantled, but the 3rd had to be very carefully dismantled in the water. It was so fragile, and again, filled with lubricants, had fuel in it. Tidal river, so any mistake and parts of that ship and its contents would be, going all the way out past very pristine islands into the Atlantic. But it was all handled very well, and again, overseen by the Coast Guard. But over almost 30 years later.
Thank you. One of the things that comes up over and over again is to have an appropriate plan and space for vessels to be dismantled that ensure that we're taking into account those who are doing the work and making sure that we have work safety standards in place, but also the environmental impacts. And so it's always interesting to learn from examples that have already done that. We have a spot called in Union Bay in British Columbia where we are seeing a tremendous amount of pollution that's happening from ship breaking. So I think it's good for us to learn from what we are doing coast to coast to coast so that we don't repeat the same patterns. So thank you for that information. Ms. Brokenshire, could you clarify, you had mentioned a voluntary non-anchor zone, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the responses that you received to allocating this zone a voluntary non-anchor zone, and any changes that you've seen to that area. Are people voluntarily following those recommendations? Some more information would be helpful.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for the question. Yeah, as I say, we have a very engaged community, a lot of waterfront property owners around the bay, and we also take really good inventory of our eelgrass beds, our vital nursery for our forage fish and salmon species. So coming out of Washington State, the idea came out of Washington State, and we did install these voluntary no anchor zones. And that they've been in place for 3 boating seasons now. And I'm happy to report that we haven't seen anybody go inside those zones and anchor. And I think, we've done lots of education around that. So I'm just really pleased with that. And then if people do sort of like kind of go inside there without anchoring, there's, as I say, there's lots of kayakers, there's lots of people that utilize the bay for recreation now that the derelict and abandoned vessel problem is somewhat been resolved, that they're also very, very good educators. So we've had great success with that.
Thank you. I find interesting, it sounds like there was a bit of a community buy-in on this that has resulted in a cultural shift on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable in this area. And it seems like that has influenced a lot of the decisions that are being made in this area. Would that be accurate?
Yes, it hasn't been without controversy too, especially when we talk about liveaboards and how that feeds into derelict and abandoned vessels. But yes, it's consistency, consistency in messaging, all the tools, the legislative bylaw tools in place, and community buy-in. Yes.
Thank you. I think this speaks to the importance of having the community involved in these processes and making sure that there's full consultation of all those who are actually living in the communities who are impacted by these decisions. I realize there's only a few seconds left on my time, so I wanted to ask you a little bit more around the impacts of the seafloor of all of the mooring vessels, but perhaps we can find time for you to answer that in another question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for being here. Mr. Mitchell, you mentioned your community is on a tidal river. Could you explain the jurisdiction over the dock space, the foreshore, and the underwater land? Who has jurisdiction over those?
Yes, so my understanding is that the underwater land is owned by controlled by the federal government. The water lots are federal in nature, and so the town, I can't speak to where the land jurisdiction kind of ends and the water begins, but it was certainly not ever something in municipal control. So everything that was federal was handed to this organization.
Okay, this sounds slightly different from what I understand to be the situation in British Columbia, where in a river, the river bed is actually provincial crown jurisdiction. So that would be significant difference again from East Coast to West Coast. So I'm hoping we can maybe get that clarified. The vessel remediation fund, it's been proposed that there be a levy of $10 flat fee applied to pleasure craft and a fee based on vessel size for commercial vessels. That $10 fee would be basically every 5 years. Would that fee cover the costs of removal or remediation of a vessel?
Certainly on the East Coast, it wouldn't. Just thinking of the cost of just moving the cormorant, which was towed to Sheet Harbor. My understanding, just the towing fee was almost $1 million, and then you have to pay to scrap it. But on the West Coast,
same question for Ms. Brokenshire.
I think potentially for pleasure craft, being an average of about 25 feet, fiberglass hulled. Right now, the cost to demolish and dispose of said vessel is approximately $3,000. So, I think potentially that fund could be useful.
$10 every 5 years would pay for $3,000?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay. Sorry. But if there collectively, if there was some access to funds,
you don't feel that fee would simply get eaten up by simply the administrative cost, the administrative costs of the fee?
Yeah, I mean, there'd be a little bit more money there, I guess, if it did go into a coffer of sorts. But yeah, I'm not too familiar with what's being proposed either. So
okay, you mentioned disposal and so on. What type of materials are able to be repurposed or recycled? I mean, steel vessels or aluminum vessels, that seems fairly apparent, but beyond that, is there any recycling available?
I mean, the wooden boats are just landfilled. The fiberglasses, they're crushed into cubes, and I don't really know what they do with those cubes of fiberglass afterwards. I think a lot of them are destined for the landfills as well. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, I'll go back to the jurisdictional piece because you've spoken a lot about the buoys in the bay and so on. This has been a similar problem on Shuswap Lake and working with the regional district there. The jurisdictional battle seems to be ongoing over whose jurisdiction it is, whether it's Transport Canada, whether it's Ministry of Environment, whether it's provincial, or whether it's even the regional district to determine who has the responsibility or who has the jurisdiction to be able to remove unregistered buoys and so on. How have you managed to work around that? Is it easier because it is a marine environment, a sea type environment, that it's really just the federal government, or is there multiple jurisdictions involved there as well?
Yeah. So in my experience, it is just clear with our scenarios. The seafloor being provincially regulated in and around Bowen Island, but the water column and the buoys are federally authorized. So it's been clear cut. It's Transport Canada that I go to. I go to the navigation protection officers, and they're the ones that I really lean into heavily for support.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Callaway for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses, thank you very much. I'm going to start with Mayor Mitchell. First, Mayor, thanks for your opening testimony to kind of give us a picture of how the derelict vessels impact a community, not just from an environmental standpoint, but that alone would be enough, but also property values and just a community self-esteem aspect. And you talked about the journey, I think it's 21, 30 years, something to that effect. It got me thinking in terms of, with your leadership being on the grassroots, you clearly heard about this every day, going to the grocery store, the home hardware store, whatever the case may be. And, we've come to a successful resolution 30 years later. Speed, that's not. I'm wondering if you can kind of drill down a little bit on your testimony in terms of this example. I was going to call it a best practice. I'm not sure I'd call it a best practice, but give us some recommendations from a federal perspective, working with community, working with municipalities. What are we doing well, and what can we be doing better? Based on your experience in Bridgewater, which I spent a lot of time in. I used to work at the Nova Scotia Community College and spent a lot of time at the Lunenburg campus. And then I'll share my time with Ken Hardy, MP Hardy. Thank you.
And thank you. Great question. So I think what's happening well now is there's some tools in place. There's some insurance requirements for larger vessels, certainly, to make sure that if they are abandoned, there's a way to get the funding out of the insurance company in order to scrap them. Certainly for us, the ship source, we need to think of a new name. It's a tongue twister. The Ship Source Pollution Fund was something that we could tap into, which I think makes the decision easier when it comes to the federal government and the Coast Guard, because you don't have to use taxpayer funds, right? It's always should be a much more thought out, difficult process to trigger $1 million check for ship dismantling. So I think that made it easier. So I think those things are working well. I think what could be improved is each of you are elected to represent your communities, and some of your communities have abandoned vessels. And sometimes I feel that the disconnect can be actually with the Member of Parliament, who for our riding, it's massive. It is Halifax all the way down almost to Yarmouth. So my MP has, 6 hours in a car sometimes just to get from tip to tip. And so the disconnect might be on really understanding the full impact. And so as a mayor, I sometimes feel I don't always have the access to the federal government people who can help make a decision for my community. And because sometimes it also goes beyond just the Member of Parliament. government, not in government. That depends on what side you are sometimes. So if there's something that can be improved, I think it would be the collaboration between all parties when it comes to that grassroots, what the impact is on that community. And for us, again, 30 years to remove some of these vessels that clearly had a number of impacts. It should have been much shorter.
Totally agree. I'll pass my time off to MP Hardy.
That should be enough. Actually, it's a question for Ms. Brokenshire. Got some correspondence from the Cadborough Bay Dead Boat Society. That's very poetic sounding, isn't it? And the Victoria Yacht Club. This will be a simple yes or no answer, okay? They say in British Columbia, the province owns the beds of inland seas such as the Strait of Georgia. As such, BC provincial laws apply to coastal land use activities such as the use of beaches, long-term moorage, or sitting and building docks. Or siting and building docks, each of which are also subject to the Canada Navigable Waters Protection Act. But also, they report that within British Columbia, the seaward boundaries of waterfront municipalities are deemed to extend 300 meters seaward from the natural shore boundary. Accordingly, municipal bylaws and associated regulations applicable to activities, development, and land and water use within those areas are eligible and applicable. Is that the case?
That is correct.
That is your understanding?
That is correct, yes.
So then we have real questions about jurisdiction, which I think we can take up in further questioning. Thank you.
1.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Let me come back to a question that is related to the vessel that was sunk. At the time in 2003, when the process started, I believe it ended 5 or 6 years later. The cost was about $1 million. We heard previously that since 2016, $2.2 billion has been allocated to resolve some of the problems connected to the phantom vessels. We were told that there were some results obtained. We told that some 100 or so vessels were removed from the waters. We were also told that there is currently no tool to identify them. What do you think about that? It's a lot of money, $2.2 billion. Is the money not going to the right place? Is it poorly directed? Don't we have the technology necessary? Where's the problem, in your opinion?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Certainly, just speaking as a municipality, I don't really know what tools we have other than contacting the other orders of government and the whether it's Department of Environment, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or the provincial counterpart. For municipalities, we just, especially for ours, we're a small town of 9,000 people. We don't have the staff resources allocated. So even hearing the funds that you're talking about that are available, I don't even know how we would know any of that because there is a bit of a disconnect, just kind of going back to the previous question on what we can do better. So hearing there's $2 billion of funding for this, and I think you're 100% right. In 2024, we should have better tools to identify. And I even think of, in many ways, why are we treating vessels differently than cars? Everyone has to register their car. You have to do it every year. So hearing $10 every 5 years, it seems, why aren't we doing that every year? So I think those are the things that we could be doing better in 2024.
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Debienne. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Brokenshire, I think I'm going to skip my last question that I asked you to follow up on, but it would be good, of course, for us to get in writing any impacts that you saw to the ocean floor bed from the excessive amount of vessels that were moored in that area that you were talking about. But I wanted to ask specifically about the enforcement. We know currently we have a system in place where it's easier for vessel owners to abandon their vessel than it is to actually dispose of it properly. There's a lot of good mariners out there who are wanting to do the right thing, but we don't have the systems in place to ensure that the mariners know how and where to dispose of their vessels. And it's an ongoing problem. And we've touched on it today around the delays in being able to identify the vessel owner, and we know how interconnected this is with the enforcement of this. And so I'm just wondering, you talked about how it would be helpful to see an increase of enforcement provisions in the mooring buoys. And I'm wondering if you have seen delays as a result of not being able to identify vessel owners, or delays, period, that you could highlight for us.
Thank you. Yes, yes, it is tricky. There's often huge delays in identifying the last known owner of a vessel. Sometimes I'll go through 5 different owners, or just even after 2, the scent is lost, the trail goes cold. So yes, it's really tricky in identifying. With our local bylaws in place now, with that kind of lack of anonymity, there is a better chance to find the owners, and that's because we have the jurisdiction through our letters patent for 300 meters from high water mark seaward, that we were able to establish the bylaws. That was one part of your question. If I could go to the more...
That's a big question. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could go to the mooring buoy piece too, that, as I've stated, I think is a very crucial part of all this puzzle, and that it's really tricky to, as I say, encourage or mobilize the support from Transport Canada. They do great work. They're just inundated with work, and so. As I say, in 15 years, we were able to do 2 sweeps around Bowen Island, not for lack of trying, and great working relationships with TC staff. I feel that the reactivity is there with respect to receiver of wreck and being able to quickly deal with a vessel that is a potential polluter. However, it's that identification and proactivity that is missing.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Bragdon, and what I'm going to do to make sure everybody gets their rounds in, we're going to do 2 4-minute rounds. We're going to do a 4-minute to Mr. Bragdon, then a 4-minute to Mr. Hardy before we finish up. Wait, you're up, sir.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for providing testimony today and for your time and your expertise and knowledge. We appreciate it, and your experiences. I'll start with you, Mayor Mitchell, just in regards to and you can speak to this as well, Ms. Brokenshire, from your perspective. Is there a prioritization based on the level of risk that certain vessels pose to the surrounding environments and ecosystems? And how does that get established? And have you found that there's been good cooperation with, whether it's Department of Transport or whether it's the federal government, in responding to that, saying, look, this is urgent, this needs to be dealt with, or we're going to have an ecological crisis on our hands, or we're going to have a real problem. How have you found the uptake? Because when you hear testimony, it takes 30 years to get a vessel out of the water. I know it's complicated business, not simple, but there must be a way of prioritizing that. Of prioritizing those types of situations. Can both of you speak to that? I'll start with you, Mayor Mitchell.
Thanks. Great question. I can't fully answer it because I don't know what the criteria is for prioritization. I only know that there was some, as loose as it was, in hearing that from my former member of Parliament, Bernadette Jordan, who was I believe instrumental in bringing some of the new changes and regulations for this. As she explained at the time, was why ours were not first on the list. And of course, I thought all of our things should be first on the list, but I understood that there were some others. But I don't know what that criteria is, and it is perhaps something that needs to be revisited, because as I said in my opening remarks, at many points, the cormorant sunk, touched the floor, the seabed, listed, chemicals were coming out, and yet, fast forward, it was still there 10 more years. So if that's not, on the cusp of an ecological disaster, I don't know. Maybe others were worse.
There was ongoing communication with the department throughout that time, Mayor Mitchell, like reaching out to, is it Department of Transport or DFO or your area MP, I'm sure, trying to say, look, this is an urgent matter. Was there any extra efforts put in at that point? Did you find? Was the response there? Or is there a mechanism? Obviously, there needs to be more clarity around that. That's for sure.
Yeah. So the responses were a bit unique, I think. So the responses we got when the vessel was first sinking wasn't to remove it. It was, can it be taxed differently? Suggestions were made by other orders of government that the town perhaps declare it dangerous and unsightly property. Well, a vessel moored is not, it's not something with a PID.
You told me they were worried about wording and categorization rather than dealing with the problem?
Correct. Yeah.
Wow. That's shocking. Would that be similar on the West Coast, Ms. Brokish?
Yeah, so as has been talked about, is our problem is more, they're pleasure crafts, so small, generally speaking, but it's sort of that cumulative effect. So with respect to assessing for risk of a potential boat that's going to sink and the taxpayer is going to have to pay for that removal and disposal, the risk is not determined to be great, but yet there's many of them. And the areas in which they are moored are vital sort of areas, very ecologically rich areas, protected areas, estuaries, those sort of places. So I would say the risk evaluations are not effective. Yeah.
Would you describe, both of you, would you describe it as a confusing process as is currently and not clear for either municipalities or key stakeholders? So you need a whole lot more clarity around this. Am I missing something here? I just want to be sure.
No, I would agree with that sentiment. Yes, it is very confusing. And again, the smaller you are as a municipal unit, you have fewer and fewer resources. So for our staff, we can only go to DFO, Coast Guard, or Environment. And beyond that, we don't know who to turn to.
And it becomes
Thank you,
jurisdictional.
Mr. Bragdon. You're going a little bit over. We go now to Mr. Hardy to finish up.
Thank
4
you,
minutes
Mr. Chair. Good. So it looks like identifying the owner of the vessel is really a challenge. And I presume if we're dealing with a lot of dock and dash, it just sort of appears and everybody, just blows down basically. Has there been any, well, first question, I would presume it's easier to abandon a vessel at a buoy as opposed to the dock. Is it easier to just basically leave the vessel and escape undetected at the buoy?
We have cameras at our docks, so I think that level maybe deters some people, but we have had vessels left at docks. But I think at buoys, I think you're correct, that it is easier. Yeah.
Is there no mechanism by which somebody who comes into the dock or a buoy has to log their presence with a harbor master or anything like that?
In certain areas, that is the case. Like Gibson's in Howe Sound Gibson's has a harbor master and has some regulation around what has to take place when you come in to moor. And we too, if you're going to be having a mooring buoy in Mannion Bay, you have to register that and through our bylaws. But that's been through a lot of staff resources and municipal involvement that we've established that bylaw, and a lot of municipalities don't have those regulations.
It would seem, firming that up at the head end would basically remove a lot of additional costs, excess costs at the other end when you're trying to clean up the mess. Do you have the ability, for instance, I'll just describe a regime here. You come in, you dock, or you tie up at the buoy, and you don't register. Can there be a mechanism in place that, say, after X number of days, you can impound that vessel?
You can if there's bylaws in place at the local government level. So
well, there's an idea for you.
Yeah, but the costs are incurred by the local government to do so.
Okay, so twice now we've looked at suggestions and cost sort of intervenes. I think we need that kind of conversation to suggest that, again, an investment up front can mitigate a lot additional costs, not to mention the disruption. I mean, you guys need to read Broken Windows, which is, you know, a policing and civic strategy that, you know, took place in New York City years ago. I think the same applies here. So perhaps the nature of the conversation needs to shift from what's going on now to better identification of vessels and owners, and the proper, if you like, you know, legal framework and funding up front that'll prevent the kind of issues that we've been talking about here. That's going to go into recommendations, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. I want to say thank you to Mr. Mitchell and Ms. Brockenshire for their testimony here today before the committee. I'm sure everyone was enlightened by some of what they heard, and I'm sure it'll show up in the report along the way. So we're going to suspend for a moment now as we change out witnesses. We got to do a couple of sound checks, and then we get back at it again. Suspended. I'd like to thank the witnesses for the second panel. We have Mr. Eric Daly, Chair of the Cadboro Bay Dead Boat Society, and Bob Perth, Chair of the Friends of Shoal Harbour Society. Thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will each have up to 5 minutes for your opening statement. Mr. Daly, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
From Cadboro Bay in Victoria. My name is Eric Daly, and I am the chair of the Cadboro Bay Dead Boat Society. I'm not going to talk this moment about license of occupation for mooring buoys or riparian rights or intertidal zones. A lot of that is contained in the information that we have provided. Let's start off and let's pretend that one day a rusty old RV drives onto your lawn. The RV owner and their friends start throwing their garbage onto your lawn. And then, oh my goodness, they empty their sewage holding tank in your driveway. And then they move to another neighbor and the party continues. I also want you to imagine that while all this is going on, you're living on the seabed with the creatures that live in the eelgrass. Moored boats are dumping garbage and sewage on you. So we have a problem here in Cadboro Bay, and starting in 2017, we removed over 15 vessels from the beach, various sizes, mostly sailboats, one burned out hulk of a houseboat. We're presently looking to work with the ministry, with the provincial ministry and the municipalities of Oak Bay and Saanich, because Cadboro Bay is blessed with having two municipalities. So it's a multi-jurisdictional thing right from the get-go. We're also working with the Songhees First Nations and a group called Sea Change. We're cleaning up the bay and replanting eelgrass. With a license of occupation, which will be managed by the Royal Victoria Yacht Club, boats that come in to the mooring field will require insurance. They will require holding tanks, and we're hopeful that a minimal fee, and which has not been determined yet, this will be a money in, money out. No one is trying to make any money here. We just want to keep the bay clean. And for the people that are mooring in the bay, there's a housing crisis. We know that. And if people are following the rules and doing everything properly, that is certainly not a problem living in the bay. We would like to talk to somebody, perhaps the RCMP Marine Division, about, quote, welfare, wellness checks on the people living in the bay. Winter's coming, and we get sou'easters in Cadboro Bay, and we don't want other boats up on the beach. Once they hit the beach, they become quite dangerous. Every little kid wants to play pirate, and they want to climb all over the boats, and these are not safe. We've looked at other jurisdictions. Washington State, just south of us here, has a system that we think is pretty good. A few years ago, I went back to my homeland of Norway, and we took a cruise, and I would call it fjord intensive, from Oslo to North Cape. And I counted derelict vessels on that trip. And when we got back, the number was 0. So I don't know what they're doing, but they're doing it well. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to Mr. Pearlt. You have 5 minutes or less, please. You're on mute.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Bob Peart. I live in North Sandwich, just outside Victoria. I'm chair of Friends of Shoal Harbour, or FOSH, as we call ourselves. A priority for FOSH is the proliferation of derelict and abandoned vessels in Shoal Harbour Migratory Bird Sanctuary, so your invitation's timely. I want to acknowledge the complexity of this matter and thank the employees in Transport Canada and Coast Guard for their help. We have a positive working relationship with them and appreciate their assistance. We're very frustrated because of the lack of progress on this matter. However, just recently there was a notice in our local paper to dispose of 2 vessels in CM Harbour, so there is some progress. The points I'm making today are national in scope. However, I speak to you from the Sandwich Peninsula and the surrounding waters of the Salish Sea. Our harbours are filled with derelict and abandoned boats. The situation's out of control, and local folks are really fed up. However, rather than dwelling on this dire state of affairs or assigning blame, I want to present a few solutions. My overarching message today is the time has come for the federal government to reassert their legal powers, enforce existing legislation, and provide the leadership that's so desperately needed. Point 1. The federal government needs to empower and support community initiatives such as what Eric was just talking about. There are a number of positive local solutions evolving in our coastal waters in our effort to fill the niche vacated by the federal government, Bone Island. However, their success requires the federal government to fulfill their legal obligations. Likewise, for any initiatives being led by Indigenous people or Indigenous guardians, their efforts will be a moot point without federal support. Similarly, for provisions of the BC Land Act and the Coastal Water Lease Permit process. Specifically, to Shoal Harbour Migratory Bird Sanctuary, any progress being made by groups like ours or the Canadian Wildlife Service is impeded by the lack of federal attention. So the federal government needs to support the difficult work that these community-based measures are trying to put in place. 2, Transport Canada and Canadian Coast Guard enforce their existing legislation, redefine associated legislation, and empower local communities to manage their private mooring buoys. The core source of any vessel of concern is the virtual unlimited supply of private mooring buoys. In 2004, the responsibility for the private buoy regulations was transferred from the Coast Guard to Transport Canada. This was a mistake. Since then, Transport Canada has largely failed to exercise its authority to enforce these regulations. As well, the federal government's narrow definition of mooring buoy as a minor work and the narrow definition of abandoned and dilapidated hampers our efforts to enforce. This situation needs to change. 3, return the oversight, enforcement, and compliance of the private buoy regulations to the Canadian Coast Guard. The federal government needs to return to the level of control that existed prior to the 2004 transfer. The Coast Guard's best suited to provide this leadership. We need a single authority to manage the moorings, and this authority should be the Coast Guard. DFO oversees the Coast Guard, so it makes sense from a management perspective to transfer the legal authority and funding back to the Coast Guard. 4, the owner registry of vessels needs to be modernized. Transport Canada has for years repeatedly stated the owner registry will be modernized. We see little progress. Without knowing the ownership of vessels, our bays will continue to be polluted by these abandoned vessels. As Eric said, Washington State has a system of annual registration. It's effective and it's enforced. Canada needs to put in place a similar system. So thank you very much. The time's come for the federal government to assert their legal powers, enforce existing legislation, reestablish their role prior to the 2004 transfer. It's time for the federal government to provide that leadership that Canadians expect, and so that related governments and community groups can do their work with confidence. The concern is, without these changes, our coastal waters will continue to be dumping grounds for these unwanted vessels. So thank you very much.
Thank you for that. We'll now go with our line of questioning from our members. We'll go to Mr. Small first for 6 minutes or less. And I will tell members I'm going to have to be strict on the time because it's not a full hour. We've got 40 minutes of questioning left. So when it's 6 minutes, it's 6 minutes. If it's 5 minutes, it's 5 minutes. So when you're ready. Mr. Small.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the chastising. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Pert, we keep hearing a lot about private mooring buoys, and I guess it's more of a British Columbia thing. I haven't seen much of it in Newfoundland and Labrador. So who owns these private mooring buoys?
No, and my understanding is that you could go into a harbor and dump a motor, an old motor, hook up to an old motor, and just attach your boat to it.
So who has jurisdiction over the waters where these private mooring buoys are in place?
It depends. Mostly it's federal. The private moor buoy sits in British Columbia. The private mooring buoy sits on BC Crown land. And if you're within 300 meters of the shore, the municipality's got some jurisdiction. So it's very complex. It's very confusing. But the whole thing centers around private mooring buoys. And this situation did not exist prior to 2004.
So they're all inside the jaws of the land, which is BC provincial government jurisdiction. Why don't they just go out and remove them all, get rid of them? If they remove those mooring buoys, do you think that would solve any of the problem? Or would vessels still be abandoned and just throw out their own anchors? And
that's exactly what they do, sir. They just throw out their own anchors. And, Eric has got as much experience around this as I do. And it isn't just as clear. It isn't clear just for the province to go out and clear it, because there's also there's overlapping federal jurisdiction. So the private mooring buoy regulations right now are the responsibility of Transport Canada, and the regulations aren't being enforced.
But if there wasn't one single private mooring buoy in place, would we still have the problem?
I don't understand, sorry.
Well, it seems that the private mooring buoys are getting a lot of blame for vessels being abandoned, but wouldn't folks still tend to abandon their vessels even if there were no private mooring buoys in place?
Oh, yeah, sure. They'd put it next to a beach or a dock, but the private mooring buoy situation makes it so much easier and facilitates the problem. And the enforcement of the private mooring buoys is with Transport Canada.
Thank you very much.
And they're not being enforced.
So, in terms of the hazard to the environment, to coastal environment and the ecosystem, how would you rank these abandoned and derelict vessels and the buoys? How would you rank that up against open net pen salmon farms?
Oh, I don't think it's an apt comparison myself. What you've got in our harbors are small. Our harbors have got these boats in them. Many of them haven't got storage tanks. Some of them are scraping the bottom. Some of them have got hazardous waste, and this is being left in our harbors and bays. It's a very serious problem, and the enforcement rests with Transport Canada, and Transport Canada isn't enforcing the private mooring buoy regulations.
So DFO has jurisdiction over salmon farming, and we hear it in the media everywhere, every day, about how bad salmon farming is for the ocean ecosystem. But I never hear anything about the abandoned vessels and the the effort to try to get those vessels and the moorings out of it. So,
well, if you lived in British Columbia and if you lived in certainly in the bottom part of Vancouver Island and Salt Spring Island, you'd be hearing a lot about it, sir. The folks here are pretty fed up. Coast Guard has got numbers, and the numbers are anywhere from 1,500 to 6,000 abandoned vessels. It's a very serious problem.
Wow. So there's a lot more abandoned vessels than are in the registry. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
So how do we go about getting that registry updated?
Well, there are two things I'm suggesting. One is that the responsibility and regulations for the private mooring buoys should come back to Coast Guard, the way it was before 2004. And the second thing is we're recommending that a registration system, perhaps similar to Washington State, be put in place by the federal government. So as one of your witnesses was saying earlier, it's same as the car. You register your car and you drive. You need to register your boats before you can move them.
Enough time for another question there.
Thank you for saying that, Mr. Small, and I apologise for chastising you earlier. We'll go to Mr. Hardy now for 6 minutes or less.
Oh, no, you can go ahead and chastise him. That's okay. He chastised me, too. Mr. Peart, I wanted to ask the first question of you, but to do that, I have to give Mr. Daly some credit. I picked up your submission to the committee today, the Cadborough Bay Dead Boats Society, and I wanted to quote something from that piece to Mr. Peart. It says, despite entailing the use of provincial crown land covered by water, BC land use policies for private moorage does not apply to mooring buoys used for private moorage because the provincial responsibility for regulating that use of provincial lands has been relegated by policy edict to Transport Canada. So at one point, the province had the pen, the hammer, if you want to use a curling term. You said it should go back to the Coast Guard from Transport Canada. Transport Canada is just worried about navigation. That's all that they really focus on. But in fact, sir, would you not suggest maybe it goes back to the province where it started out?
You'd have to talk to someone more knowledgeable about me than maybe perhaps Eric would know. But the responsibility prior to 2004 rested with the Coast Guard, and private mooring buoys, as I understand, have been a federal responsibility. Where the BC Land Act...
Because my time is limited, then perhaps we can go to Mr. Daly and suggest that, the responsibility should go back where it used to be, and that is to the province, which basically has, the land use, including the seabed, inside, in all of the, the interior ocean frontage that we have in BC. Mr. Daly?
But if I may say...
Sir, Mr. Peart, I need to ask a question of Mr. Daly. Go ahead, sir. Mr. Daly, that was to you. Do you think that it should go back to the province where it used to be? And you're on mute, sir. Not yet. There we are. You got it.
Oh, thank you. One of the things that we are facing, and we are in a jurisdictional quagmire out here. As far as I understand it, the seabed is the jurisdiction of the province. The water between the seabed and the surface is Fisheries and Oceans, and the surface is the Coast Guard. So when you come in and drop a mooring buoy in a bay, you are in fact touching on 3 different jurisdictions and would require, I would guess, if you did it properly, 3 licenses. However, people come into any bay and they throw something overboard, attach a line to it, and they end up drifting ashore,
and there
sadly.
you go. Okay, now, sir, I'll have to again interrupt here because my time is limited and I don't want to be chastised here. Yeah, well, you know, fear of God. All right, so we've got the problem now. Between the two of you, we'll start with you, Mr. Peart, and I'm sorry to have cut you off earlier. What is the eventual solution that makes all of this go away?
My understanding is the best solution is to return as it was before 2004, and if Coast Guard have the responsibility for private mooring buoys.
Okay, with respect, sir, that doesn't get to the root of the problem of people abandoning boats. Mr. Daly, your comments, please.
My comments it would be that people from every jurisdiction should sit down and, like my school teacher said, sit down and play nice and figure out your jurisdictions. And until we get it done, we will continue to do these things. We have to look at what Washington State did. I got all the papers on Norway. They run a good show. And I'm not saying that because I'm Norwegian.
Okay, you're allowed. I think, you know, when it comes to recommendations, we're brimming with them here because, you know, the reflections that we had earlier that we could treat vessels much the same as we treat motor vehicles, you know, requiring vehicle identification numbers or vessel identification numbers, including some hidden on the hull so that, you know, we could actually identify who owned the thing, but also, you know, very active harbor master activities to ensure that anybody coming in, mooring to the dock, mooring to a private buoy or a public one, if there is such a thing, has to register with the harbor master, and if they don't, the boat gets towed. You know, these are the sorts of things I think we need to be talking about rather than squabbling over the jurisdiction that we have with the current condition. Let's eliminate the current condition entirely, sir.
May I just say that in many of our harbors and bays, there are no harbor masters, and so that makes it really awkward.
Purdy, we'll now go to Madame Debienne for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Very interesting. Very interesting indeed. I am going along with that logic. Every province has a car dealership that are well identified. You have people who own companies. They can be identified. They have serial numbers. They are registered. You have less or fewer vessels than automobiles. Why can't every province come up with a similar identification system for identifying vessels that are circulating and being used within the territory of those provinces, and so that it's easier for them to be identified on our waterways? Is that a solution that we could tailor to navigation? We deal with vessels as if they were cars. Is that already the case? They have numbers, but are they identified? Is anyone listening to my interpretation? Any of the witnesses listening to my question through the interpretation? Otherwise, my time will have to be paused.
So do you want me to try?
Oui, bien sûr, un ou l'autre. Vous êtes deux experts. Donc
yes, we have two experts here, so any of you could answer.
Again, I don't understand the constitutional authority here. There is some federal responsibility, but if the province, like British Columbia, could have a system such as that, some kind of registration system is really needed. Whether it's provincial or federal or a combination of both, I don't understand how that would work, but some kind of registration system similar to what's happening in Washington, that's what's really, really needed.
Donc, un système d'immatriculation.
So, a registration system, so to speak, with an owner who is clearly defined, with an address, a real person. Is that what you mean?
Alors, à ce moment-là, on pourrait repérer.
So, we could more easily identify the owner, remind him of his obligations in case a vessel were to disappear.
Because right now, my understanding is that many of the vessels that are being abandoned, it's next to impossible to trace the ownership. So you can't go to Mr. Jones and say, please take your vessel out, because it's so confusing as to who actually owns the abandoned vessel.
Et une fois que le bateau est au fond,
but once the vessel is at the bottom, we need to be able to know that the vessel has moored somewhere. If it's at the bottom of water, is it more difficult to identify? Is there a system to identify them? Couldn't we focus on such emitters that would help us identify the vessels?
Yeah, there really needs to be a system such as what you're saying, whether it's provincial or federal or some kind of authority, but we need to be able to trace the ownership of the boat, whether it's attached to a buoy, a dock, or whether the boat actually is sunk on the bottom. And right now it's really, really difficult to trace who actually owns most of these abandoned and derelict boats. Eric, do you want to add anything?
No, thank you. Whatever Bob says, I totally agree with.
Pour faire référence à la Norvège ou même dans l'État de Washington.
Could you maybe refer to the situation in Norway or elsewhere? Do you have anything to say? Are we ahead when it comes to technologies being used to identify vessels, even if they're at the bottom of water?
Ouais, je pense que monsieur, il a pas compris ma question.
I would say Canada, again, I don't know what's going on globally, but the system Canada has right now is quite inadequate. There is no registration system, and Transport Canada says that there will be one coming, and we've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and nothing seems to be coming. I understand even recently there was some kind of bill passed in the House of Commons about some kind of registration fee, but we're holding our breath. We haven't seen any progress on the registration side of it at all. And along with the transfer of ownership of the private mooring buoys, those two things together are really key and why we've got such a problem out here.
Thank you, Madam Debienne. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and welcome to our witnesses here today. The first question is going to go to, that I have today is going to go to Mr. Dolly. First of all, I just want to mention, I would love if you have, you'd said the papers on what's happening in Norway. I would love for that to be submitted to the committee for us to review. It's always important for us to be able to look at examples, not just within Canada, but internationally. So I would love to be able to see those. But my question to you, Mr. Dolly, you have in the notes that were provided to us here, one of the, on the second page, you say, we therefore need, and you talked about the requirement for succinct criteria for evaluating and rating the safety and environmental risks of listed and reported pending derelict vessels, and a provision to alter its listing and response plans accordingly as so warranted. And this really resonates with what I'm hearing from within the community, where people are expressing their concern that the bar is too low for the environmental impact that needs to be assessed before the boat can be pulled out, and all the problems that go along with that, that there's the strict criteria, the bar is too high, so then it waits to get it pulled out, and then they're sinking, then they're bringing them back up to float again, then they're sinking again. It's just this ongoing problem. I'm wondering if you can speak around how important that this criteria is to see the necessary action being taken in a timely manner. When
a vessel comes into Cadbury Bay, when the ship hits the sand, so to speak. We immediately get a hold of Coast Guard. We immediately call upon our group of volunteers, and we go and we quickly evaluate the boat, and we relay back to the Coast Guard with pictures of what is happening. And sadly, unless there is an oil leak or a gas leak, it kind of gets on a back file. Nothing happens immediately. Or we've had a couple of occasions where there have been some hypodermic needles washed ashore. When the boat washed ashore, that gets the attention of the local police. But without a hydrocarbon spill, the boat can languish on the beach until the pirates come along and strip it of all the shiny bits. And then the kids come and play on it. And and it becomes very quickly a derelict and something not worthwhile doing anything with except begging and pleading and borrowing to get the damn thing off the beach.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I just want to emphasize how much I appreciate both of you today highlighting in just very descriptive ways the real impacts that this is having on people on the West Coast. We know that this has implications coast to coast to coast, but in particular on the West Coast, we are seeing the detrimental impacts of a lack of sound federal strategy that interconnects all of those involved. So I appreciate that information. Too many questions. I'm going to go to Mr. Pert. Mr. Pert, in the notes that you provided to us in point 2, you speak about empowering local communities to manage private mooring buoys. And one thing that stood out to me with our previous witness, Ms. Brokenshire, who talked about the bylaws that were in place through, I believe she's a member of the Bowen Island Conservancy, and she had talked about the fact that through this process, the municipality takes on the costs. And I hope I'm remembering what she said accurately. But I was wondering if you could speak to how important it is that we have a federal strategy where the federal government is taking the leadership required for these strategies so that municipalities who are already overburdened with downloading of resources are not feeling the impacts of the necessary steps that need to move forward with the mooring plan.
You're on mute.
Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, and I was able to listen to your previous witnesses. But we've got False Creek here, Deep Cove, Bowen Island, Kelowna, Gorge Waterway. There are a number of communities that are trying to move forward to control this. But again, without the more federal authority on the private mooring buoys, the abandoned boats just shuffle along. So say that Bowen Island, there's a vessel there that they don't like, so they approach the owner. The owner will just move to the next harbor. As long as as I said earlier, the core reason for a lot of these abandoned and derelict boats are the fact that the private mooring buoy situation isn't regulated. And so, yes, communities have got this 300-meter zone. Places like Bowen Island, et cetera, put in a license of occupation. It's helped the situation locally, but it isn't helping the overall situation in the sense that the private mooring buoy situation still, the regulations aren't being enforced.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Arnold for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both witnesses for appearing today. I want to start out by just making sure we're clear on something. Are vessel owners required to register vessels when purchased under your understanding? Are vessel owners required to register the vessels?
If I can answer that with some of the experience we've had in Cadbury Bay. First, the two happiest days in a boat owner's life is the day he purchases it, and the day he gets rid of it is the other best day.
The question is, are vessel owners required to register their vessels? Because I've checked the transport or the Government of Canada website, and it says they are.
There are many vessels that change hands with a few dollars, and there is no record.
But are they required to register those vessels by law?
When initially purchased, but a boat could be in the water for 30 or 40 years and have seven different owners, and so the confusion is after the initial purchase.
But when I look at the Government of Canada's website, vessels owners are required to register a vessel under the large vessel registration or pleasure craft license. They are required. So
when they purchase it,
no matter who from, when they purchase it, not necessarily brand new, whenever they purchase it. And I can state this because I used to be in the small vessel repair business.
Yeah.
And whenever a vessel is transferred, you are required to transfer the registration. What is happening? Can you say whether that law is being enforced or not?
It is not being enforced.
I agree.
So we currently have laws that could address this. They're simply not being enforced. Is that correct?
Correct.
Mr. Daly?
I agree wholeheartedly. There are vessels in Cadbury Bay that have old K numbers on them that do not exist anymore. And they've been handed down from a lot of cash deals that you can't trace it.
Thank you. Mr. Pert, you mentioned that Transport Canada is committed to modernizing the vessel owner registry. When was that commitment made?
I don't know the details. I'm just saying I know that the conversations I have with individuals in Transport Canada is they say, yeah, we're working on it. We're working on the system. We'd like to do it. Yes, we need a registration system. And more recently, I was told by Elizabeth May that there was a bill passed in the House of Commons to set up some kind of registration system through Transport Canada. Again, I don't know the details, but I think that's happened within the last 6 to 9 months.
Again, Mr. Pert, you mentioned that regulations are not being enforced. Can you elaborate a little further as to what regulations you were referring to?
Most of them would be related to the Private Mooring Buoy, the Navigable Waters Act, and WABA. And so those are the...
what would WABA be? That's an acronym?
WABA is, let me just look it up. I always have to look myself. The Wrecked, Abandoned, and Hazardous Vessels Act. And that enforcement prior to 2004 was more directly related to the Coast Guard, and that responsibility was transferred out then to Transport Canada. And subsequently, since 2004, Transport Canada is not enforcing the regulations effectively as the Coast Guard was.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Daly, you mentioned that we're in a jurisdictional nightmare. Can you just take 30 seconds and elaborate on that?
Well, I can only speak from Cadbury Bay, where we have 2 municipalities, First Nations with an interest in the bay, the province, the federal government with the many departments. For example, when we phone in to report a vessel on the beach, the first thing that happens is they say, "Are there?" Like I said before, are there any hydrocarbons leaking? If not, we then, if we can make it to that boat, we discover, for example, that there is no number on it at all. There is no plaque in a window, in a porthole saying, in case of emergency, call. The boat may have been tied up in the bay for months. We have no idea. So it's, and then on the beach, the municipality of Saanich has put up signs that say in case of emergency, and there is the Coast Guard emergency number. And it falls between the cracks more time than not. When we first started in 2017.
Thank you, Mr. Daly. We're going to have to end it there. We'll go on now to Mr. Weiler for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I do want to thank our two witnesses for their testimony thus far and for being here. I'll just continue on the jurisdictional quagmire. I know that, Transport Canada will have a role if there's a navigation risk with mooring buoys and otherwise. Sometimes DFO will have a role if it's in a small craft harbor. And as Mr. Daly was saying before, you have a number with the Coast Guard that you can call if there's an emergency situation. My experience has been from hearing from constituents in my riding that they're oftentimes waiting for weeks in those cases, and sometimes those situations actually get much worse. With that in mind, question to Mr. Pert. I'm curious from your point of view. You mentioned that this was a system that was better regulated when the Coast Guard had the responsibility for this. And I wonder why the Coast Guard is better suited for this, or if this might be just a matter of resourcing for Transport Canada.
Well, it seems to me that the Coast Guard is a logical place. First off, the Coast Guard's got boats; they can get on the water. Transport Canada, in a lot of cases, haven't got boats. Certainly out here, our experience is they haven't got access to boats. The Coast Guard has got the ability to kind of get on the water. They're more local, they're regional. And prior to 2004, my understanding is the system worked quite well. And the Coast Guard seems logical to us because of, again, it's within DFO. There's more of a direct relation, and it just seems like a logical body for us. I suppose it could be done by Transport Canada. It would have to be resourced much, much better than it was. And it also have to enforce, which it hasn't. It would also get clarification around what abandoned boats are and clarification of that. And we'd need a clearer definition around abandoned and derelict as well. So could be done by Transport Canada, but I think it's cleaner to have it sit with the Coast Guard.
Next question to Mr. Daly. A situation that I find out often playing itself out is you have a boat owner that's wanting to get rid of a boat because it's getting to the point where it's falling apart, and typically finding a vulnerable Canadian that oftentimes is living in with housing insecurity. And then this person ends up becoming a liveaboard, and they don't actually end up registering that boat. And you have someone living in an unsafe situation, and no way of actually tracking this. And so I unfortunately see this set of circumstances playing out over and over. And I'm wondering, from your point of view, what is the best way to approach this type of a circumstance?
Thank you. If and when we get our license of occupation in Cadborough Bay, then the moorage field will be under control. And in order to moor in the moorage field, you will need to have insurance. You will need to have a holding tank. And we are hopeful that part of the and by the way, the Royal Victoria Yacht Club has agreed to manage the license of occupation in Cadbura Bay, and when the people come in and sign in, their boat will be checked, and we also want to have part of this as a wellness check, so that every so many days, if their time has expired and they're going to leave the bay or get their stay renewed, there would be like a wellness check. And we'd like to work with the RCMP Marine Division on that if there is, in fact, an issue that the representative from the yacht club, when they go to a vessel and they see something that they are not happy with or concerned about, that they can contact the Marine Division. The municipality of Oak Bay does not have a Navy. So.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Waller. We'll go on to Madame Debian now for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je vais
Thank you, Chair. Any of the two witnesses could answer, but what I'm going to ask is in the brief sent from the person who originates from Norway. I'm sorry. You said there are more than 100 factors to help assess risks and determine the risk of each vessel. If we have to go through the 100 factors, and if there's one hazardous material or illicit material, because we know some abandoned vessels have been used for crime, in your opinion, having simpler criteria that are better adapted and in phases, let's say we start with 10 criteria, which could tell us whether there's an environmental risk. 10 criteria that tell us that there may be illicit material on a vessel, and we proceed by priority when we are looking at any abandoned vessel. Is this an approach that could be more productive and more efficient, in your opinion?
Are you asking Eric?
If they're asking me, I don't have the translator up and running on my machine. Sorry.
So what I would say is that one of the first steps is the federal government needs to clarify the definition of mooring buoy as a minor work. And I think they also need to have a clearer definition of what abandoned is, a clearer definition of what dilapidated is, and you can do this by regulation. And then once that's been clarified, I think that you could go to an organization like the Coast Guard, and they would very, very easily be able to set up a list of criteria as to what is hazardous, and I'm sure they could come up with 3, 4, or 5 top criteria pretty quickly.
Thank you. We'll now go on to Ms. Byrne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you again for all the important information that you've provided to us today. One piece I wanted to sort of bring it all together with was the point that we know that on average, if we look at every year, we see approximately, now this is a very rough number, for every one vessel that's cleaned up, 5 are being abandoned right now in British Columbia. So those are extraordinary numbers. We can see that what we're doing is not meeting the need. One thing, I believe it was Mr. Daly, I'm not sure, Oh, right. Sorry. The other point I was going to mention is that, in particular, we're seeing the impacts in some of our local communities. In my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith, along the coast of Ladysmith, there is just what they're calling vessel graveyards that are building bigger and bigger. I know in Gonzales Bay, we're seeing a problem as well. And I was wondering, perhaps I'll start with you, Mr. Dully, and then Mr. Pert, if we have time. Can you speak to how important this is that we have a national strategy in place that's taken into account First Nations, municipalities, province, the federal government, all working together to see a comprehensive strategy put into place to address this issue?
If we don't all work together, we will continue just being smacked from pillar to post as we go along. And like I say, Cadborough Bay is blessed with 2 municipalities, and not that people would point fingers at another jurisdiction, but it appears to happen. And as a former bureaucrat, I look at the links between municipal, provincial, and federal, and it gives this old fella a headache trying to figure out just what it is that we're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. And perhaps Mr. Pert, any final words on that?
Yeah, it's absolutely. We need a comprehensive national approach that brings all the jurisdictions, municipalities, the parties together to figure out a way to move forward. But I would just preface that with saying that in the meantime, the federal government needs to enforce its existing regulations, transfer the powers back to Coast Guard, and set up a registration system.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I want to thank our witnesses, Mr. Daly and Mr. Peralt, for their... Peart, yeah. Peer with a T on the end of it. I want to say thank you to you both for sharing your knowledge with the committee today as we work through this particular study. I see Madame Debienne is putting up her hand for something.
Simplement rappeler quand on fait les tests.
I just want to remind everyone that when we are doing sound tests for virtual participants, we have to make sure that they know how to access interpretation, because sometimes we may lose precious seconds because of that.
Madame Debienne, and I'm sure the clerk will make note of that, and hopefully, but in a lot of cases, people don't have anyone there to tell it to, kind of thing, to figure out the interpretation and the translation and whatnot. So again, thank you everyone for a great meeting today. Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.